Hey, I'm Pep, and this is a Pep Talk. Now today, we're going to be talking about Keyflower. That's right, I'm going to be doing a very specific Pep Talk on just the one game. And I plan on doing a couple of these this week, so gear up, get ready, be prepared. Wait, that's a villain song. Anyways, Keyflower. So if you've never played Keyflower before or heard about it or anything, it's essentially a worker placement game. But this isn't really a review, and so this video might not be for you. Might be good to find a review, maybe one that I have, or one that someone else has, or whatever. But instead I'm going to be talking about in this game is how to win, how to do well, what some good strategies are, what are some strategies to avoid, what to do when your opponent does certain things to you, etc. Let us begin in spring, as the game does, and as years do. Spring is a wonderful time, full of growth, and you might notice that your town starts off with only one single building, so you really want that growth. Now this game is very interesting because it changes season to season how you really need to strategize, where putting your workers matters, all that kind of thing. For example, in spring, odds are more of your workers are going to go towards bidding than towards anything else. And for good reason, because you want to bid on these tiles so that you have access to have them in your town for later. Now, here's where strategies can diverge a little bit, because having a lot of good buildings is great. It means that not only can you put your workers there in order to get more workers for later, but it means that your opponents may place workers there, which is, again, giving you free workers for later. But, on the other hand, the game is only 4 rounds, and the 4th round is a little bit less of a round. And the first round is the round you're in, so whatever you get this round doesn't really matter. So the benefits only essentially last for 2 rounds. I keep doing that, that's 4, 2 rounds. Well, okay, Pep, so which one do I do? Do I try to get things, or do I let my opponents get them and use my workers for other stuff? Well, you can't just let them have everything. You probably want to get at least 1. Now, if you are aiming for one, then you probably want something that has the potential to generate a particular type of resource. There's a few tiles that may come up that will give you, at the beginning, just 1 of that particular resource. But after you upgrade them, they could give you 3 every time you go there. So if you're going for the kind of strategy where you want to focus on your opponent's things more than your own, and you're only going to grab 1, maybe 2 buildings, those are the kind of buildings you probably want to go for, because your strategy will likely end up being a stockpile strategy, where you use other people's buildings in order to bring a lot of stuff into your town, and you're looking for some of the buildings later that will grant you bonus points for having a lot of one particular type of resource. Now, on the other hand, if you're just playing a more normal game, you probably want to try to grab as many buildings as you can within reason. Like in most games, all buildings have their own advantages or disadvantages, but there are 2 particular ones I want to talk about from the spring set. One of them is the Peddler, which allows you to make green workers, and will allow you to make even more green workers if you upgrade it. Now, it's possible that this or the other building that made green workers won't even come out in a game. But if it does, I can almost guarantee you somebody is going to try to get it. And how much people are willing to invest will probably tell you whether or not it's worth it. If you have to use half of the workers from behind your screen in the beginning of the game in order to outbid somebody to get this, it's probably not worth it. You're probably investing too much, especially because depending on when you upgrade it, likely your opponent's just going to get the first grab at taking those green workers anyway. But if people don't seem excessively interested in it, and you can get it for as little as, let's say, a bid of 2 or 3 workers, then yeah, you probably do want to grab it. On top of that, you might even want to take its action in the first round to get yourself green workers. If you happen to be the first person to do that, not only can you set the color that is needed to bid on it, but you'll also get that worker back. And I'm going to come back to the green thing, but because I've talked about getting the worker back, I want to bring that up. If it looks like you are likely to win one of the bidding tiles, it's a really good idea to put a worker onto it to take whatever action that tile provides. Because That's going to come back into your town, and you're going to get those workers. That's something that a lot of people forget about when playing this game. You get back the workers on the tiles in your town, and if you win a bid, it's in your town, you will get those workers. So let's just say, for example, that you happen to start with like 7 of the yellow workers, or not yellow, but any color. Perhaps you have only 2 yellow workers, but like 7 red or blue. Well, first thing you might want to do is stick a red or a blue onto this tile, because then you can throw away one of the yellows, let's say again you had 2, and get yourself some green workers. And then if you have more, you could later do it again. Now you have another green worker. And then with the leftovers, you can try to outbid people. And again, if somebody's going to bid like 5 or 6 workers in order to get this, then it's probably not worth it anyway, and they can just have the workers you put on top. But if you instead can outbid everyone else and they won't go higher than the 3 or 4 that you have left, well, you get the extra 3 workers that you already put onto this tile, and on top of it, you have the tile in your side, which will either pump out a lot of green workers for you, or will guarantee you that your opponents will keep coming so they can get the green workers. But you know what? I've talked a lot about these green workers, so why do people care so much? Well, they care because these green workers aren't in the regular bag of workers. They're separate, and for good reason, because at no point, if green workers haven't been introduced into the game yet, can people get them from this bag. And if you recall, whenever you bid on something or take an action with something, somebody will have to use the same color of worker in order to bid or take that action there. So these green workers can essentially either guarantee you a tile if no one has any green workers yet, or lock it to green workers, meaning that people have to invest something that normally would be an auto win. And that's really big. If you're playing a game where things can be restricted and you're trying to bid on certain things and being able to take a certain action more than once is important, well, congratulations. If you're the only one with green workers, you're really going to dominate that game. So in the example I gave before, where you start off in the first round by going and getting possibly 2 green workers before the tile's even in anybody's village, well, in round 2, fall, summer, that's how the seasons work, you're going to have a big advantage. How big of an advantage? We'll get to that later. But for now, we're going to talk about, in my opinion, one of the other most important buildings that can come up in spring, and that is the stable. See, the stable is like your home tile, except way better, especially after you upgrade it, and it can do 2 upgrades in one go. This can make a huge difference in gameplay, especially getting it this early on. You might be able to upgrade some buildings that you normally wouldn't be able to just because of the excess movement you get. On top of that, there are tiles that come out later that can potentially double that movement. And one of the endgame tiles can also give you bonus points based on how many movement you have in your town. So with that, and perhaps one of the ones you get from a later season, you could get a lot of points, or at the very least, force your opponents to invest very heavily in making sure you don't get those points, which honestly can be a good thing in its own right. And before we move into summer, I want to talk about that, about avoiding overinvesting. It's like when I was talking about the peddler tile. Just because it looks really good doesn't mean it's worth investing half of your resources into. And in a game where a large majority of the game is based on bidding, well, it's kind of important that you don't go too overboard. And it's important that you don't let your opponents overcharge you and try to ramp your bid up. Maybe you seemed really excited about this, and so, you bid 3. Well, your opponent's going to jump on and bid 4. Not because they want it, but because they think you'll pay 5 for it, and maybe they're right. But they shouldn't be right. You shouldn't be willing to overpay for something. And if it doesn't seem like they're necessarily going to have the main advantage, then it doesn't matter. Just let them have it. On top of that, do you remember the strategy I told you for this, where you purposely take the action twice while it's already sitting there on the board, whether you win it or not? That's important, because you're going to go into the next round with 2 green workers. So when you go into that next round, often the person who owns this will try to upgrade it. It's pretty easy. It only takes a gold. They might have access to gold already, in which case they might upgrade it very fast. Heck, they might have even upgraded it. No, they couldn't have upgraded it in spring because you can't upgrade anything in spring. But the point is, they'll likely try to upgrade it pretty fast. And whether they do or don't, it's fine. But you should try to be the first person to go there. Because do you know a really interesting color to go to this with? Green. You're probably saying, Pep, that makes no sense, especially on this side. You're giving up your green worker to get another green worker? Yeah, you are. Because remember how your opponent decided they wanted to pay 4 or 5 to outbid you? Well, they did. And they succeeded. They outbid you and they got this tile that they think is going to be amazing for them because they're going to get green workers. Well, thing is, they're not. Because if you go there with your green worker, you replace the green worker you lost, and you guarantee no other player will be able to go here on that round. But you will. And do you know the best part about that strategy? Well, you can just do it again next round. Especially if you happen to go first, cool. Put your green worker here, guaranteeing that no one gets it, and you still have a green worker for next round. Assuming you didn't use both of them in the summer. Something to think about at least, especially if the other players get real excited thinking they're going to get a lot of use out of those green workers. Keep the pool limited, keep it to 1 or 2, keep control, and make sure no one else gets it. And if they happen to upgrade it, oh, you're paying 1 green worker to get 2 green workers. Heck, at that point, it's just gonna be amazing for you. But let's talk about summer now. See, summer introduces a lot of interesting tiles, many of which are these tiles. The boat tiles, I'll call them, but not like the other boat tiles that you bid on. Anyway, these have very interesting effects, and each of them have 2 sides. Now, I don't want to get into these too much, but they are generally pretty good effects. And whenever these come out, I suggest reading them and paying attention to them, because they can really change a game, especially, as I mentioned, this one that gives you double movement and upgrade. See, the big thing is, if you have this and you actually get the tile later that gives you points based on how many movement you have, this doubling is included in those points. So let's just say you got real lucky and you happen to get up to about 14 movement. Is that possible, or does it cap at 12 with the next one? Either way, you're going to double that. That's going to be 24 points off of 1 tile. And likely it's going to be a tile that nobody else wants. Or at the very least, it won't benefit them, but it likely will benefit you greatly. So just pay attention to these. They can really help you just do great things. But since we talked so much about green before, I can't help but mention that there's another one of these that comes out. This one instead uses up blue workers whenever you use it. If this comes up in the possible buying whenever you get into summer, that strategy that I talked about where you lock them down likely won't work anymore. Unless you want to get real nasty. Because if you put a green worker onto the one that I mentioned before, and then also put a green worker onto this, again, you're replacing your green workers and you're guaranteeing that other people can't get their hands on these. Heck, if you put a green worker onto this one while it's in the middle, you get a green worker from it, which you can just put to bid on it later. So you get the 1 green worker guaranteed back after you win, and then on top of it, you win guaranteed again because nobody else has green workers. So again, if you get the green workers, seriously think about taking the denial strategy. It will probably produce some interesting results. At the very least, it'll probably throw some people off at your table. Maybe even make them a little mad, if that's your goal, which it shouldn't be. Next up, I of course have to mention, there's another movement tile in this set. If you can get it, it's really good. It again upgrades to give you double upgrading, and it's really easy to upgrade. It's 2 of any resource. So movement is good, think about it. And there's lots of other tiles that come out here, but there's a few tiles that do this. And that is giving up something, in this case a worker, and in this case an upgrade tile, I believe they're called. No, it's a skill tile, skill chip, skill something. Either way, you give them up in order to get more workers. These are great to pick up, not only because you can use them to get more workers and throw away things you don't need to get things that you maybe do need, but on top of that, they upgrade and can give you a large amount. And if you have this in your city or town, other people will likely try to come to your town in order to gain this, and they'll be giving you workers in order to get more workers, essentially. And if these are in your town, these are great spots to put your workers because you give up a worker to get more workers. And then you can do it again to get even more workers, and then whenever your next turn starts, or next round starts, you get a whole bunch of extra workers. Which leads me to talking about what I think is a good strategy for summer. Because see, spring and summer, as I mentioned before, are very different. In spring, bidding matters a lot more. But in my opinion, in summer, instead, taking actions matters a lot more. You're either A, taking the actions of your opponent's tiles in order to perhaps restrict them to colors they don't have access to, or just to get access to something that they think they're going to get a good use out of before they do. Especially if they upgrade something before they've put a worker on it. And if you happen to have been the kind of person to win a lot of bids in the early round, and you have a town that's maybe 4 or even 5 in some ridiculous situation tiles large, use your tiles. Ignore almost everything else. If there's something in the middle that's amazing, maybe try to bid on it, especially if you have a green worker, try to bid on it. But if you can, just abuse the heck out of using your own spaces. One, it will put a little bit of a rush on your opponents because your opponent might be willing to pay 2 in order to use one of your spaces, but they're not going to want to pay 3, and they're not going to want to give you 3 workers. So by putting 1 on it, it rushes them and makes them feel like they need to try to take your actions, and it gives you more workers for the future round. And if you spend all of your workers on actions in the middle, in your town, and don't really focus on the middle at all or other people's towns, then when it comes to the next season, fall, you are going to have an amazing round because you're going to essentially have double, or in extreme cases, if your opponents really like whatever tiles you got in the first round, you might even have triple. So that can be a good reason to grab a lot of tiles in the spring if you have the ability to. Because remember, as I said before, this game is only so many rounds. So if you do this in the summer and you have all that stuff to spend in the fall, well, you have 2 options when you get to the fall. You'll either be able to do the same thing again and have basically infinite workers for winter, or you will spend almost all of them on stuff in the fall, which we'll get into, and then just have a normal amount of stuff to spend in the winter. Either way, it will probably help you a lot, and it'll really help you dominate your other opponents. Now, other than that, I don't really have a lot to say about summer. Summer is pretty self-explanatory. You're still buying tiles that give you resources or let you exchange things or do something. And you generally just want to try to take whatever actions benefit you the most. Now, why would you want to take opponents' actions, for example? Well, they may have upgraded something, as I mentioned before, without putting a worker on it first. In my opinion, don't do that. I don't mean don't take the actions that they've upgraded. Do that. That's good. What I'm saying is, if you have an ability, like I talked about before with the green workers, in order to get even more because you've upgraded it, don't upgrade it first. Put a worker on it first and then upgrade it. I know it seems like you're wasting things because if you were going to do it anyway, let's say you were going to do one of the ones that, only produces 1, but then after you've upgraded it, it produces 3. Well, of course you're going to upgrade it first and then you're going to use it because then you get 3 instead of 1. But the thing is, if you upgrade it, almost guaranteed one of your opponents is going to get there and get the 3 before you do. So you're giving them some stuff and you're making it so your first action has to cost 2. And then your second has to cost 3. So you're paying, in essence, 5. Whereas if you go there first and you put the 1 on, after you flip it, your opponents are going to be less likely to go on it, but even if they do, they're going to put 2 there, and then you're going to put 3 there. So you've now paid 4 instead of the 5 that I talked about earlier. Almost always, it's going to work out better for you if you just put a worker there first. It also helps you dictate colors. Now let's talk about dictating colors since I just brought it up. Whenever you put a thing on something, as I mentioned, that is now that color. You have to put a green on that tile, or blue, or yellow, or whatever you're using. But the thing is, you know what workers you have. If you have a nice spread of 5 of each, then whatever. It doesn't matter to dictate the colors. But if you have 8 yellow and only like 2 of the others, well, you really want to dictate yellow on things that you think you're going to need to use, or things you think you're going to need to win bids on. So dictating those colors early is really important, especially on your own tiles. Nothing feels worse than having an opponent put a blue worker onto your tile and you having no blue workers, or maybe even just 1 blue worker to use, because now you can't even use the tile. So make sure to dictate things the way you need them to be. And on top of that, because you see the boats that your opponents pull in, you can often see kind of what colors your opponent's going to have. Most people spend almost all their workers in the first round, spring. But the thing is, after they spent them, the ones that come in are either, as I mentioned, A, off the boat, or B, coming back from whatever they brought into their town. So you have almost an exact number of what workers they have. Now, it's going to be a little hard to memorize this in some cases, but you have a general idea. You don't need to count all of the 3 colors, but you can at least note that they have an excessive amount of yellow. So if you're in a bidding war with that person, maybe you just don't try because you know they can outbid you. Or you purposely try to dictate yellow onto things that you think they would try to put workers onto. That way they can't abuse it too much. They have to be the person to put 2 workers on it. I can't really go through every situation, but just know that dictating the color is a big part of this game. And if you're playing an aggressive strategy where you want to shut your opponents down, how you dictate things can change the game in massive ways, especially if you're using green workers. But as I said, that's pretty much all I can say about summer. Before we jump into fall, though, I want to talk about building your city. Because see, there's lots of ways to build your city, but generally you want to try to keep things pretty much together. You have to travel by roads in order to move things around, so you want to make things close enough to themselves, or close enough, or not themselves, the things that they need to upgrade, or close enough to your home tile that the things you pull in from other people will be able to get to your things easily. If you happen to have gone for the excessive movement strategy, then maybe it doesn't matter. You have so much movement that you can just move everything pretty much freely. But for those who haven't done that, as I said, it's important to keep them pretty close together. But something else to think about is that at the end of the game, you're likely going to grab one of the final tiles that will give you points for every tile surrounding it. So you probably want to try to build towards that. And the different ones have different road patterns, so you have to build carefully. You probably want to build one side a certain way, like all grass, and then leave the other side as open as you can until the last round. And again, I won't go into exactly how you want to do this, but just it's something to keep in mind that you probably want to build that circle, because that can be, 5 or 6 points easily. And odds are you'll get at least one of them, especially if you have green workers. Okay, yes, green workers are good. Let's move on. And we'll move on to this tile that you can get in fall, which helps you make green workers. Okay, I'm sorry, I didn't move on. So if you hadn't gotten any green workers before and this comes up, this can be another way to get green workers. If you're taking that strategy I talked about with the excessive denial, honestly, once a third one comes out, it's not going to work anymore. People are probably going to stop you. Heck, if you had the one in the first round and you're just getting to this now, odds are people are going to try to stop you anyway by putting workers on one of these to get their green worker. So usually at this point, it's too late. But if this is the first time this comes up, it's a perfect time to start that denial strategy, because you're going to be the one who gets these green workers, and you're going to get them right before winter, where you're bidding on some of the biggest point gaining tiles in the game. So if this comes out and it's the first green one, you want it, but you don't want to win it. That doesn't matter as much, really. You want to be the first person to put a worker on here and get access to green workers. And you know why, so I won't keep talking about it. Another movement tile is available, so you can really up your movement. If you got all the movement tiles from all of the rounds, then congratulations, you may just decimate the game if people let you have that final score. But the other kind of tiles that are now available in fall are a lot of these tiles that do nothing. They have no effect. Instead, they simply flip and give you a lot of points. Now, in my opinion, engines in this game are usually more likely to grant you points. Things that can give you repetitive things and let you work towards the end game goals. That being said, if people aren't bidding very heavily on these, and you can get these for as little as 1 or 2 workers, these are amazing grabs because they're pretty easy to upgrade, especially this late in the game. And 7 or 10 points can definitely be the difference between winning or losing. A lot of the other tiles that are here are just duplicates of things you've seen before, but the other type of tile, and the one that you're likely going to be looking for, are these. These tiles that give points for the amount of a particular resource that you have. I talked earlier about how you probably, if you want to go for this kind of strategy, you probably want to take a particular resource, let's say one that gives you a lot of wood and gives you the triple wood so you can keep building up wood. This is why you do it, for when these come out later. Now, of course, you're not guaranteed that the wood one is going to come out. But if you happen to have grabbed 2 of them and you haven't invested too heavily in one or the other, then when these come out, you can simply take the one that gives you the most advantage. And on top of that, worst case scenario, this one might come out. And this one, you can just say whatever resource, all of them are worth 2. That's big, that's huge. So those can be game winners. And when these are game winners, they're game winners usually by a lot, because if you've built up enough, one of these tiles can easily give you 30, 40 points, which sounds insane, but think about this. If each one of your coal or iron, whatever the black resource is, gives you 3, even your gold, which are normally worth a point anyway, you'll probably put towards this, because that's a lot of points. That's 2 extra points per gold that you've earned. So these are definitely something to think about when you're going into the final round. And it's important to watch when your opponent is going for that kind of strategy as well, because if you have ways for denial and you notice that comes up and they already have a lot of things built that is towards that, you may want to hate draft and try to outbid them on that tile. Maybe you're the person who's been taking advantage of getting all the green. Well, now you can put a green on that and guarantee they can't get it, because that will likely change them from winning the game by an extreme amount to losing the game by a moderate amount. And if you don't have the ability to outbid them, at the very least, you can take that particular spot with a color that you think they don't have a lot of, and like the spot on their board. And then you just make sure that they can't keep producing it, because in theory, if they have the one that gives a triple, that's 9 points every time they produce on that. That is insane. So you really want to try to take advantage, make sure that they can't invest too heavily in that. But honestly, that's all I really need to talk about in the summer. Generally at this point, if you're building an engine, your engine's already going at this point, and this will give you the final little gear for your engine that makes sure that you're going to have that strategy going forward. So this is where it's really important to pay attention to what your opponents are doing and kind of do a quick little point check in your head and just see how far ahead they are, whether or not you need to try to thwart them. This isn't really the kind of game you can always play peacefully, which I normally try to. Often you do have to try to be a little mean to people in order to make sure that they can't just run away with the game with a strategy like that. Even the green strategy I was talking about doesn't usually let you run away with the game. All it does is make sure that you keep control of the green so that other people can't use them to run away with the game. Especially because you keep using your green in order to make sure no one else can get access to them. You might get 1 or 2 things here or there, but it's usually a pretty safe strategy. Not necessarily a good strategy to win with, though. But on the topic of winning, let's talk about winter. See what I did there? What kind of a round winter is can really depend on how the game itself has gone. If people are very aggressively playing the game, then maybe when you get to winter, it will be, pretty long because people have a lot of workers left over that they've used, or maybe a lot of people won't put their tiles into the middle, so there won't be much to bid on, and you'll have to spend a lot more time using your own little engines that you've built. That's the complicated part of winter, because at the start of the game, you're going to get 3 of these winter tiles and have to pick which ones you're going to put in for bid. Now, this can also be a really important part of the game because, as I mentioned before, these, especially the ones that you've put down because you've had the ability to strategize with these the entire time, can make a massive difference. Maybe you happen to have had the one where you get bonus points for green workers. Well, if you've controlled the green workers the entire time, or you've just used the tiles and built up a lot, this could be worth a lot of points. Especially if you're using your green workers in your own town in order to make sure that other people can't go there. The green workers will go back to you at the end of the game and will count towards this. So obviously, it makes sense to choose and build your strategy when you start the game based on what winter tiles you see that you have. But the thing is, you usually don't want to base it around all of them because you're not likely going to win all of these. But just because the tiles that you have don't necessarily help you, that doesn't mean you shouldn't put them down and let other people bid on them. Because the thing is, if you only put down this green one and you're planning on getting points off of green, well, thing is, people are going to notice that that's the only thing you're bidding on, and they maybe don't have better options because you denied them the ones that you had in your hand. So they're just going to outbid you on that or try to make sure you don't get it. By giving people some extra options to grab for points, as long as they're not worth more points than whatever you're doing, you ensure that people have other things to bid on. Why deny you 10 points and get 0 when they could just go for something worth 8 points? Heck, you might even be able to outbid them on both anyway. But in the same regard, it's important in this particular season that you want to watch what things come out and what people have and what they've possibly been building towards. And there's so many variations on what things could be available. So whenever they all come out, it's a good idea to quickly read the rule book, make sure everyone knows what all these things do. And yeah, this is the one season where bidding becomes very important again. If you've been using your engine, maybe you need to use your engine a lot, but if you have been using your engine, you'll have a lot of workers likely because the engine was in your town likely. So this will mean you have a lot of workers in order to just dominate the bidding. If you've used the green strategy, you'll be able to dominate the bidding that way as well. But be very careful. This is where color fixing, is that the word I used before? Color, it isn't, but I forget what I called it before. Where dictating the color of a particular tile is very important because your opponents might do it to you, and if they kind of know you don't have a lot of blue workers and they dictate blue onto something you wanted, they might be able to get it pretty cheap. Even though it doesn't help them, it certainly hurts you to not get it. So dictating the color pretty early on in these is good. But in the other direction, dictating too early, especially on things that really matter to you, can kind of be bad. Because by dictating early on and by bidding on it early on, you're making people notice it right away. People have a mentality a lot of times when they play games where they see what's happening and that's the only thing they focus on. If the very first thing you do is something that looks really good, nothing else that matters in the game will matter. This applies to so many games, but in this one, it's definitely true. If the first thing you do is bid on something, you're telling the entire table that you want that is the most important thing to you. Because you could have put a worker in your town. You could have tried to deny something from someone in their town, both of which are things that people can't do a lot about. But when you bid on something right away, you are telling people exactly what you want, and they have a lot of things they can do about it. Heck, if you had been taking that green strategy the whole time and you do that, even putting a green worker there, you're just telling someone that they absolutely have to go to one of the green buildings that's available and get green workers so that they can potentially outbid you, or at least make you use up your green workers. So if you feel like other people have no reason to go for it, it's probably better to put it off for a little while. You are risking that people are going to color fix it in a way that is bad for you, but it's good to at least not do it first. Give it a turn or two. Make people think about other things. Have someone else look like the target by letting them bid first. This is probably the best time, if you haven't already been doing mental games, to start doing mental games. Do some point counting and say, oh, that particular player, you can clearly see that they have more points than the rest of us. We probably have to make sure they can't go too crazy. Maybe you point out the person who had been building up that iron or stone engine the entire game, and you're just like, hey, careful for that engine. I've seen people win that way by a lot. And then you're taking the attention away from yourself. My advice, though, when you do that kind of stuff is never lie or say something that's just incorrect. I notice sometimes people will do that. They'll try to play mental games, but when they do it, they play them wrong because they use these mental games with lies. They say, oh, like that person has 30 points sitting there right now. And if someone actually counted it, it's like 22. It's like, well, you rounded up a little bit there, friend, but also you're trying to make us focus on something that isn't even true, which means you're desperate for us to not look at what you're doing. That's all that says. And if you have someone at the table like me, if you lie, I can almost guarantee that you are going to be just decimated in that game. Because once you've lied, and I notice that you've lied, I'm going to tell people that you've lied. Or, maybe you made a mistake, but at that point, to the other players at the table, no one knows the difference. They're going to think that you lied because you wanted to take attention away from yourself. So don't lie. Don't overblow something. Blow it the exact correct amount. Even underblow it if you can. Because at that point, you point out, oh, they've got 30 points or something, and people count it and they're like, oh my gosh, it's actually 40. Well, now you have two people. You have the corrector at the table who agrees with you and is probably scared, and then you have yourself who noticed it in the first place. If you happen to have, another opponent other than the one you're targeting with the verbal play, well, odds are they're going to side with the group that both notice this. And usually there's not a lot of coming back from that. Now, this can be in some ways seen as a little mean-spirited, especially to certain people. If someone normally isn't very good at defending themselves or they get nervous really easy, probably don't do that to them. It's not really necessary in a lot of cases, and it's not fair. This is more if you're playing with a lot of people who are very comfortable with the game and, maybe that person knows the game pretty well and knows exactly what they're doing. That's when you point it out. Don't use it to bully someone. Use it to help yourself win in a game when someone else is very clearly winning. Anyway, the rest of the strategies for the game are pretty self-explanatory. You try to get more points than your opponent. And like I said, you do it by having a lot of workers at this point so you can outbid people. You want to grab tiles that are good. You want to make sure your opponents don't get tiles that are even better. And when it comes to the final bidding, you just want to try to bid on whatever things that help you the most. But it is important to count things, because if the thing that helps you the most only gives you 4 points, but the thing that helps your opponent the most gives them 22, well, you probably want to make sure they don't get that. You getting 0 points out of something instead of them getting 22 is much better than you getting 5 points. But this is where verbal play can be important. Again, pointing out that someone can make that much, especially when it's not that player's turn, well, you might have other people at the table do that work for you. So you can still get your 5 points, but the other person can just stop them. But if you have to do it yourself, you have to do it yourself. The other important part of math, and I think it's good advice for games in general, just because something is going to give someone a lot of points doesn't mean it's going to make them win. So try to pay attention to everything that's happening in the game. Because, like I mentioned before with just strictly lying about points, if you point out that somebody is going to have 40 points at the end of the game because of one tile, but fail to notice that that's literally all the points they're going to get, well, does it really make sense to try to thwart the player gaining 40 points when everyone else on average is going to have at least 50 or 60? No. Maybe they went a little too focused in that particular thing, and the reason they're getting 40 points is because they've done nothing else that game, and that's going to be all their points. Heck, maybe they knew that they were losing and they're just trying to, see how many points they can get off of one tile just because they think it's interesting. So thwarting that person for no reason other than to like take attention away from yourself. Again, it feels mean-spirited, and again, you're just technically wrong. You're not necessarily lying, but you're wrong. If you point at them and you say they have a ton of points, but they only have points from one thing, then it just looks bad on you, and it looks like you're like picking on the person in last place. And you really shouldn't pick on the person in last place when you're playing a game, even if it looks like they have like a good chunk of points coming in the future. Unless it's enough that it's going to make them full-on win, then it doesn't make sense to pick on them. So just don't do it. Maybe they've won every game they've played before. Maybe this is like the one game where they're doing bad. Well, don't pick on them when they're doing bad, because all it's going to do is make them hate you. Or at the very least, make them feel vindictive, like they're going to have a vendetta on you in the next game. Or maybe they'll think it's funny. Maybe they'll think it's funny that they went from always winning this particular game to being so far in dead last. Who knows? You know your group better than I do, but just be careful. Not a lot of things feel worse than having a player in a game with you that has a vendetta from the last time you played a game, especially the same game. And with that less than happy note, that's been my pep talk for Keyflower. If you have any questions or comments, leave them in the comments below, and I'll get back to you as quick as I can. What I'd especially like to know is if you'd like to have a focused pep talk like this for any particular games. Leave me your game selections and I'll see what I can do. I'd also love to hear if you have any advice from when you've played Keyflower. Maybe you've played it a ton of times and you know even better strategies than what I've talked about. I also don't have any expansions for it, so if you do have any expansions and maybe want to expand on my strategies, feel free. Otherwise, thanks for watching, and until next time, live free, game hard.